Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, and thank you for joining us at the Times of Israel's Behind the Headlines series. This week, I'm speaking with the authors of this new book, Isresilience, Michael Dickson and Dr. Naomi L. Baum. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having us.
It's a pleasure
First of all,
to be here.
Thank you. How did this project evolve? How did you meet each other, and how did you decide to take on this project? What Israelis can teach the world about basically resilience?
So we both made Aliyah, and you know, when you live in Israel for any period of time, I'm coming up to 15 years, you go through a lot of different things. And what Israelis do in their day-to-day lives is they go through a lot of different events. Quite frankly, when the day starts, you don't quite know how it's going to finish. And I'm talking politically, geopolitically, regionally. A war could start out, a leader in the region could be deposed, rockets could be coming in from Gaza. From the north, there may be a terror attack, God forbid, a knife intifadas, stabbing intifadas, wars. These are all things that, you know, my kids in their lifetime have seen, but when I was growing up in the UK, I never did. So Israelis have this amazing ability, this is the theory, Israelis have this amazing ability to carry on. So there's a steel in their spirit, there's a metal that's waiting to be tested. There is something in their DNA that pushes them forward despite all the various adversities they face. So I wanted to prove this theory, and I went to meet various people. And one of the first people that I met in order to produce this book was Dr. Naomi Baum. Naomi was then at the Israel Center for Psychotrauma in Jerusalem. And I interviewed her, and I was so fascinated by what she had to say that I invited her to come with me on this journey, whereby we went all across Israel, north to south, east to west, and interviewed different people from a diversity of backgrounds, some of them famous, some of them not, but all of them who faced real challenges in their lives and who have moved ahead from those challenges. And we wanted to drill down into what makes them resilient, what makes Israelis in general resilient, whether there's a sense of national resilience, and what Israelis can teach the world in terms of being more resilient.
So, Naomi, first of all, could you just define what is resilience?
Resilience is actually a term that it seems like we all think we know what it means, but when it comes to the professional literature, people are still arguing exactly about what resilience is. So the term comes from the field of metallurgy and originates from the notion that the study of metals, various metals, how much can you bend a metal before it cracks, or how much stress you can put on the object before it collapses. And obviously a sponge you can bend completely and it will never crack. So it's very flexible, very resilient. A piece of steel has a certain, depending on exactly the properties of the steel, will bend more or less, will be able to sustain more or less stress. So that's the original where resilience originally came from. The way psychologists use the term resilience means how do people handle challenges in their lives? How do they handle difficulties in their lives? And one researcher, Ann Mastin, who calls resilience ordinary magic, which is a term I really love because it describes how it really, most of us, most of the time are pretty resilient. But there is something magical about our abilities to deal with such a wide variety of challenges in our lives. Even if you look to see how we're doing with the COVID pandemic these days, you know, people are very resilient. Yes, it's not pleasant, and yes, there are costs, and yes, people are stressed out, but for the most part, people are coping and are resilient. So the notion that when you face a crisis, a trauma, a great deal of stress, you can persevere or you can bounce back. That's very often a term that's used with resilience, but the term that I prefer, and I think I've convinced Michael to prefer it as well, is the notion that people actually bounce forward. And that is a term that was coined by somebody named Frimet Walsh, who was a family therapist. She coined this term at least 20 years ago. And the notion is that when you come back, most people who experience a severe stress, like a trauma or crisis, will experience symptoms. They of a whole variety of symptoms, starting from physical to emotional to behavioral. People will experience symptoms, but most people will return to normal functioning. The notion of bouncing forward means that you bounce forward with added value, that you have new priorities in your life. You see things differently. You've reorganized. You've changed perhaps what your goal is in your life's purpose. So when you bounce forward, you take everything that you've learned from this very difficult experience and you use it in your life, and move forward. And I think we see that tremendously. We're gonna, talk about some of the people that we interviewed, but you can really see that bouncing forward in many of them.
And we took that concept and we created 3 keys to Isresilience. And so that's what underpins, we feel, all the people that we met. Israelis constantly rank amongst the happiest when they do those surveys around the world. Which nation is the happiest? It's amazing, really. Israelis rank amongst the happiest. Although when you meet Israelis, I don't know whether happiness is the national stereotype you would associate with them. Toughness, maybe. Toughness. I'm not sure about happiness. And we actually quote Robert De Niro in the book, who, of all people, said that he admires Israelis because they're warm, they're smart, and they're aggressive. But he meant that as a compliment. And so we drill down in that concept a little bit, and we talk about, the concept of an Israeli being a sabra, prickly on the outside, but warm and soft on the inside. And the truth is, that does bear out when you meet most Israelis. And that's certainly something we saw about the people that we interviewed. So we took 3 keys to Isresilience. The Talmud says that God gives us the keys to childbirth, to reign, which means material sustenance, and to reincarnation, but he leaves the rest to us. So to our minds, that means that resilience is something that is in our own hands. And so we took the 3 keys to Isresilience. They are empathy, flexibility, and meaning making. Empathy means to be conversant in your emotions, to understand your own feelings, to be aware of the feelings of others. It means that if you've been through a traumatic experience, you feel it, you don't set those feelings aside, the good and the bad. Flexibility is the ability to move on when an obstacle is placed in your path. And that happens to us on a day-to-day basis. Things don't go the way we planned. Sometimes they go the opposite of the way that we planned. So how can you move in a different direction when you need to? And in this pandemic, we've heard that word pivot said so many times. People have to suddenly change their plans. And so your ability to be able to do that makes you more flexible, makes you more resilient. And finally, meaning making. The idea that you can take from what you've been through, you can take it and turn it into something with meaning, or that something of meaning really is the thing that carries you forward. And we saw that in the stories of so many people that we spoke to.
Okay, so we'll discuss some of the people shortly, but one of the things that jumped out at me in the book, in reading the book, which is a really great accessible read. It's something you can take, for example, to the orthodontist office and spend your time waiting there, or
Just
sit
as an
outside,
example.
for example, or sit outside and enjoy the nice fall sun. But it's something that you can read very quickly, and it's very, very easy to grasp these concepts that you're putting forth. But one of the other themes that jumped out at me is something that I've lived in Israel for 21 years, and every single year I have a trouble with this particular moment in the calendar year. It's when we move from Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance of the fallen and the wars and the horrible terrorist attacks, etc., and then we immediately put on a happy face and move to the Day of Independence, and we are joyous, and there are fireworks and performances. And this too, I think, is quite key to the psyche of the Israeli. Naomi, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, that shows incredible flexibility. It really does, that ability to kind of move. And also the interesting thing is, I think it really exemplifies resilience, because it exemplifies exactly what we're talking about on all 3 levels. So if you think about it, on Yom HaZikaron, most of us all of us we feel all those very strong emotions. We feel sad, we feel proud, we feel a great deal of compassion for people who have lost loved ones. Almost everybody knows somebody, whether it be a neighbor or a friend or a relative. So there's a lot of strong emotions, and we allow ourselves to feel those emotions. We allow them. And I think that's one of the really important parts of resilience, that we don't block off any emotion, no matter how difficult. And that's exactly what we're doing in Yom HaZikaron. We're saying we're going to allow ourselves to feel this, and we are not going to worry that we're going to be there forever. As a matter of fact, we know we're not going to be there forever. We know that tomorrow we're going to be celebrating. And I find myself over the years that I get more into Yom HaZikaron, and the transition is a hard transition. But so we need to take it a little bit slower. So maybe we're not out on the streets, bopping people on the heads like we used to 40 years ago, or dancing till 4 a.m. So maybe it's a little quieter, but it's still a celebration. And the next day is a celebration. It's a celebration really with a lot of gratitude. And the whole thing is encompassed with meaning. I mean, the Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut are days that are so filled with meaning, and I think this flexibility, I can't imagine anything more flexible than that. So I think it's a beautiful example of resilience, and particularly Israeli resilience. Yeah.
So let's start talking about certain people that were profiled in the book. There are 12 profiles? Is that correct?
14.
14, sorry. Okay, I thought you were doing the 12 tribes thing.
Oh, we hadn't thought about that.
So there are 14 profiles, and I pulled out 4. And let's begin with Shula Mola in honor of Sigd, which is being observed this week, and her story ties so deeply into this holiday. Who would like to tell her story?
I'm happy. Shula is actually a friend of mine. Asher and I worked for many years at the trauma center. And the interesting thing about Asher is that in his years at the trauma center in Meitiv, he developed programs for helping Ethiopian Jews process the trauma that they went through on the way to Israel. And I knew his story. He has a harrowing story of Aliyah, but it's a story that's not often heard in Israel. It's a story, maybe in more recent years it is, but it's a story that needs to be told. And Shula also had a long adventure on her way to Israel, the Holy Land. She was 12 years old. She was her mother's mainstay. She had a younger brother. People got ill along the way. Her mother got sick. Her brother got sick. People died. People were killed. There were all sorts of terrible things that happened. And she was 12 years old. And she talks about how what kept her going all throughout the whole many months of trekking through the desert, food, without water, was this vision of Jerusalem, this vision that in Jerusalem there was the temple and everything was holy and everybody wore white and everything was golden. There was this vision that she had as that was, I guess, the stories that the Kesim would tell the children. And this is really what kept her going. And you can imagine that when she arrived in Israel, it took a long time for her to get to Jerusalem. When they first arrived in Israel, her mother was hospitalized, her brother was hospitalized. They were really not in good shape. And she was a 12-year-old girl, busy taking care of them. Really an incredible story. I think it took her about a year to get to Jerusalem. And when she got to Jerusalem, of course, you can imagine the letdown. But in general, there was tremendous letdown when they came to Israel. And we were hearing more about those stories now as well. The difficulties didn't cease. upon coming to Israel. As a matter of fact, probably in a lot of ways they increased, because when you're working towards a goal, you hold that very dear and very tight. And then you get to what you thought was the goal, and it's not at all what you thought it would be. So Shula is a remarkable woman. In the last year or two, she's really become a very strong voice for justice for the Ethiopian Jewish boys who have run into trouble with the police. She's really become a very, very big activist. And she's been an activist all along. She's very outspoken, but what a wonderful person, really a very genuine, wonderful person. And we were very grateful. Actually, she and Asher told their stories. They both told their stories. I think we spent some more time talking about Shula's story, but it was very interesting. They told their stories together, and they had each not heard each other's story till the end. And I thought that was incredible. I mean, here, a couple, they've been married for a good long time. To actually just sit and listen to each other's stories, they found it extremely moving, as we did as well.
So it's a really fascinating example for many reasons. One, of course, it's overcoming geopolitical strife and reaching the Holy Land that they've yearned for so long. But what I found so striking in this story is that she reaches her goal, as you said, Jerusalem, and she realizes it was all a fairy tale in a way, that it was not reality, but that she actually pivots immediately and, as you said, bounces forward, which was just really beautiful to read. Now let's talk about Amit Gofer. Michael, will you tell me his story?
Sure. Absolutely. So Amit Gofer is a wonderful scientist. He was a successful CEO of an MRI company, and his kids won a prize in a raffle. And the prize that they won was a truck Toron, like an ATV. And he had no use for that in his life. But to kind of make it up to his disappointed kids, he said he would take them on they'd rent them for a day and go on these all-terrain vehicles. Unfortunately, he was on one with his daughter and it hit a rock. And in a freak accident, his truck Toron was overturned. And he, at that moment, knew when he fell that this was going to have lifelong repercussions. He was rendered a quadriplegic as a result of the accident. He talks to us about what it took to overcome that injury, and I don't want to minimize that by any means. He was really in the depths of depression, and we talk about that in the book and how you can look ahead of that, and obviously it's very difficult. He actually identifies the different things in his life experience as an Israeli that he feels helped him become stronger, and he went on to turn his mind to an ingenious idea, which is to try and help people who cannot walk again. He developed the rewalk system, this exoskeleton that you put on the outside of your body, and it helps paraplegics walk again. He brought it to market. He's helped people around the world as a result to walk again. Ironically, it didn't help him. He was a quadriplegic and not a paraplegic, therefore it didn't work for him. And when we went to interview him, he was looking over at his computer at a CNN interview that he'd just done about his newest invention. So following the rewalk system, he invented what he calls the up and ride. And that actually helps quadriplegics stand up with this kind of portable kind of trolley system that they stand on and move forward. And he spoke about, when he was being honored for inventing the rewalk system, how he found himself at these kind of posh receptions, and yet it was almost degrading because there he was speaking to people and he's, pardon the expression, he's at ass level and they're all standing up. And so he talks about another reception he went to later on once he developed the up and right, and suddenly he was what they say in Israel, begova einayim. He was right at the eye level with other people, and so that's very exciting for him. It's been an amazing journey for him, and really a gift that he's given to the world. And he did it through his own ingenuity, he did it through his own talent, but he also did it through a lot of community that supported him through as well.
There are several things that jumped out to me during this chapter. One is that he had leukemia and beat it.
Yeah.
And so he was already, a quote unquote survivor. He already had those skills in place. And when he was recuperating or trying to recuperate from the accident, one of his friends came and paved the road for him so that his wheelchair could travel on the paved road.
Yeah.
And that just signals so strongly to the amount of support that he had. And that's a thread that actually runs through the book in basically every single chapter. The support, whether it can be overt or not, that these people are drawing upon from many other people. Now, one person who can't necessarily overtly draw on the support is Youssef Haddad. So who would like to tell me about Youssef Haddad and why he cannot overtly all the time draw upon the support from his network?
I'm going to let Michael tell you about Yusuf because he knows him a lot better than me. I met him and I was really very, very impressed with him. But Michael really knows him quite a bit better. But what I just wanted to underscore what you said, your point that you made about support, social support. We could have added that as a fourth key, but rather than it being a key, I see it kind of circling around and holding the three keys, as it were, because that's probably the single most important feature of resilience is the amount of support that you get from family and friends. And yes, it's true that in every single one of our stories, it's present. In referring back to the story we just talked about, Amit Gopher, he talks about how he was in this deep, dark hole after his accident. It's not like he bounced back, next day. Oh no, it took him a good long time. And for many of our people, it takes a good long time. And his wife, it was his wife and his kids who pulled him out. At least that's his feeling about it. And this story about his friend, was a story that he told us. We didn't discover it. He told it to us. Also so meaningful to him that his friend, put in this major effort. So I think that point is very well taken. But take it away, Michael.
Thank you very much. So to speak about Yosef, Yosef is a really interesting character because he's one of the characters who we interviewed who are not Jewish. And so he had a lot of choices that he made, and he chose each time, he chose the harder path. He didn't need to serve in the army, and yet he chose to serve. And that wasn't with universal admiration from his family, from his friends and family. His family were mostly supportive, that's true. But his friends around him were not. And he made difficult choices all throughout his career. It was shortly after the terrible bombing of the Maxim restaurant in Haifa, which was a symbol of coexistence, owned by Jews and Arabs, frequented by Jews and Arabs. And although he was on his road to making that decision to serve in Israel's army, that was one of the pivotal moments that sort of said to him, yes, you're doing the right thing. And so he did serve. He served in the Second Lebanon War, again, an Arab fighting for Israel behind enemy lines in an Arab country. Lots of issues there. And unfortunately, he was also injured in an attack by Hezbollah, an anti-tank missile. Shrapnel hit him, and he thought he was told his foot was severed, actually. They had to reattach his foot. And he's a very keen footballer. And so one of the things he was told was that he would never play football again. He wasn't even sure he would probably walk again. He vowed to make sure that he did. And actually, we tell the story of him coming back to the doctor that had given him that diagnosis and kind of showing off his football skills. But that was all, again, after a very long period of recuperation. And he's devoted his life, he moved away from a kind of corporate career and devoted his life to be an advocate for Israel. He goes all around the world and speaks to audiences, and sometimes very hostile audiences. We talk about him being in South Africa during an event, what they call the Israel Apartheid Week by the BDS movement, the anti-Israel boycott movement, and he's speaking very vocally for Israel. So he's really swum against the tide in every direction, and someone who is very admirable.
In terms of empathy, I think one of the most striking instances happens in this chapter, actually, and it's when Youssef is at a university event speaking with two other former Israeli soldiers, and one of them asks him, "Are you going to sing Hatikva?" the Israeli national anthem. And for those who don't know, one of the lines talks about the Jewish soul. And Youssef says, yes, I will, but I'll change one word. I'll make it the Israeli soul. And when the trio sings it on stage, sings Hatikva, the two other Jewish soldiers also change it to the Israeli soul. And that, I have to admit, and Naomi, you said we can feel emotion deeply in Israel. I have to admit, tears were rolling. That got me for sure.
Yeah, us too, us too.
Now, the final person we're going to speak about is Sherry Mandel. Many people are unaware of the tragedy that befell the family and know the Mandel family mostly through Comedy for Kobe, which is a joyous event that happens every year. This year it was online, of course, and it raises money for the foundation. And the very fact, I think, that the family is known for making people happy speaks a lot to the personality of this woman. Naomi, would you like to tell her story?
Sure. So first of all, Sherry is a neighbor of mine. She lives just in a town about 10 minutes away, and I've known her for many years. She and her husband moved to the community where they lived, Tekoa, in about 1998 or so. And in the year, I think it was 2001, her oldest son, who was 14 years old at the time, was killed in a brutal terrorist attack. He and a friend of his were playing hooky from school, and they went to the nearby wadi, which is like a ravine that, you know, kids hike on, and, you know, you want to just a little bit of quiet time, you want to make a little fire or whatever, they'll go there. And he went there, and he and his friend were brutally murdered. It took a while to find them. It took many hours to find them. It was a terrible tragedy. I remember it, personally, I remember it because we all went to the funeral, and I have a son just about the same age as Kobe, so you really identify with that. And Sherry talks about how she was really out of it after that for many, many, many months. And her friend Shira would come every single day and take her for a walk every single day. Just kind of let her be. She would massage her and talk to her and go for a walk with her. But it was months and months and months and months and years. I mean, the healing process was a process of, I would say, I don't think you ever recover from it's not recovery that we're talking about, but what Sherry and her husband Seth have gone on to do is live a very full life, and not only live a full life, but have found a way to make meaning out of this terrible loss and to live a meaningful life. And I think for me, they personify, and Sherry personifies that meaning in life. They created a foundation called the Kobe Mandel Foundation, which you referred to. It's changed over the years, but initially it was for children who lost family members in terrorist attacks. So it was something closely related to their loss. Over the years, it evolved more into an organization that helped children and families deal with loss, whether it was a terrorist attack or an illness or whatever. And there was a real need for an organization like this, a real need for a place for these kids to be together and share with each other. With each other, they could be normal kids. With other people, with regular kids, people who were always pointing out, oh, he lost his brother, or she lost her sister or her mother. And what they did is they made summer camps and winter camps and all kinds of various activities for these kids.
And I would add something else that, you know, the organization that I work for, Stand With Us, was founded because of the tragedy of Kobe Mandel. We're very close with the Mandels because that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back out in the big wide world, and in Los Angeles, where we were founded. The story of Kobe was reported in a way that kind of blamed the victim for his own murder. And so for us, that was an understanding that Israel is not being reported in a truthful way. And that's something that we wanted to do something about in terms of educating, particularly young people, but broadly the public, about what Israel really represents. So actually, the Mandels have really made meaning from a horrific tragedy that, of course, as Naomi said, they'll never get over from. But you mentioned, Amanda, you mentioned the comedy, and actually good humor was something that flowed through every single interview that we did. Tragedy, yes. Tears, yes. Emotions, yes. But also amazingly good humor. And I think that's something that resilient people have, a positive outlook and the ability to laugh and emote in a positive way as well.
I think you quote Sherry as well as saying something like, when you know death, you know life. Meaning, once you have reached the depths of despair, you realize there is another side to that teeter-totter of life, and you can reach that too. So let's take advantage of it. So let's learn some tips actually to take advantage of the teeter-totter of life, and how can we become resilient people ourselves or raise children who are resilient? Because that too is a theme in the book about how childhood can really affect the resilience of an adult if something comes up. So I think, Naomi, you're the expert here.
So how do you raise resilient kids? I think one thing is that you allow kids to experience whatever it is that they're feeling. You don't minimize. If they're afraid, you don't say, oh, don't be afraid. Or if they're angry, oh, don't be angry. Or if you're happy, or why are you so happy? You like explore the feelings with them. Allow them to experience those emotions. We would like our kids maybe perhaps to be happy all the time, but we know that's not really very realistic. And by example, allowing ourselves to feel these emotions and allowing the kids to experience the whole gamut of emotions, I think is really quite important. And when it comes to flexibility, so often in our lives, one door is closed. And when that door closes, it's okay to be upset. It's okay to be unhappy. It's okay to be disappointed, and give that a little time. But then after a while, it's time to say, okay, what else can I do? What other doors are opening for me? Where else can I go? What else is calling me? So helping kids negotiate that change. And encouraging them to explore all their options, I think is another piece to it. We all need to, I think as adults, we're all working on finding meaning in life all the time. It's not that you say, okay, I'm a psychologist, this is my meaning in life, or I'm a mother and this is the meaning in life. Life is so dynamic, the meaning is always changing. So I think that having a conversation, having that as a piece of the conversation, understanding that meaning in life is not something esoteric that only philosophers talk about, but it has real practical implications. Like, what gives you meaning? What gives you joy? What gives you a feeling of satisfaction at the end of the day, at the end of the week? Conversations about like, what good things happened to me today? Or what would I like? What do I hope for next week or for the next year? We have these conversations often at the beginning, at the new year. What was the best thing that happened to you last year? Or what are you hoping for next year? But I think these are conversations that are important to really keep around the dinner table at all through the year. And I would say the dinner table is a real important piece of resilience. I think that the dinner table allows people to talk about what's going on and provide that sense of connection and support that is just so critical. And what else can parents do to raise resilient kids? Limit their screen time. Oh yeah.
A bit difficult.
We don't talk about that at all in
classroom.
Come and police it in our house, please, Naomi.
What'd you say?
Come and police it. We need you to police it.
Right.
I would
go ahead.
I would add to what Naomi said. My kids right now are reading Isresilience, and they're telling me what they learn. And I've actually had quite a few readers tell me that once they finish reading it, they pass it on to their teenage kids. My 11-year-old is reading it. They're choosing the chapters they relate to the most. They're telling me the lessons they learn, which to me is like, the most gratifying thing in the world, obviously, but I think it also tells us that resilience is something you can teach. And, you know, we talk about in the book, are you born resilient? Do you learn to be resilient? Well, the answer is both. And certain types of people, given their family background, given what kind of circumstances they were born into, will be born more resilient. But that, you know, we don't choose that. So we just get whatever we're given. When it comes down to it, we can, however, learn to be more resilient. And so for me, taking these keys to Isresilience and reading these stories is something that kids can do. And I think that we can teach them that, you know, things don't always go your way, and you will face obstacles and challenges, but it's about how you cope with them. And I think that's a really important lesson to learn.
I really appreciate this end of our conversation, because I have to admit that when I was reading the book, I felt so unworthy, as you know, the great, we're unworthy, because every single individual that you chose was such a hero, really, in his or her own way. And so knowing that, yes, we can put this into our own lives, talk about making meaning in each particular day, not necessarily to be a war hero or climb Everest or whatever else. And that's really a great lesson to take away. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I fully endorse this book, as did my boss, David Horowitz. You can read about that on the cover. And please pick it up.
By your endorsement, we're honored by David's as well.
Thank you so much.